Hey everyone, it's Coding with Kareem, and today will be our last video on asynchronous programming in JavaScript. Our first video was on non-blocking code versus blocking code. Our second video was on the basics of using promises and using the then method off of a promise. And now we're finally going to look at the async and await keywords and how we can use them to write clean asynchronous code. So in this file, I have a function, hello world, and as you guys can see, it returns a promise that inevitably resolves to a string. However, if you guys look at the code, this simply just returns hello world, a string that says hello world. So why is it that in TypeScript this is still valid code? The reason why is because async, an async function will always return a promise. So in TypeScript or in JavaScript, when we write an asynchronous function, we're saying that this function will return a promise. And it doesn't matter what happens uh, aside in this function, it will always return a promise. If we don't necessarily return something, it will just return void. So that is what the async keyword does. It essentially designates a function that returns a promise. Let's say we remove this async keyword right now. Let's see what would happen. We would see now that we get an error in our VS Code. And the reason why is because now it's saying that, hey, a string is not a promise that resolves to a string. Those are two different things. If we wanted to fix this, we'd actually have to manually declare a promise. Let me quickly see if I can do it. Kind of like so. And hello world, perhaps? Is this the same thing? Yes. So if we actually wanted to write this legacy way, we would have to write it like this. But this was what essentially was covered in the last video. So using async and await is really just wait, damn, I can't really say the word, syntax sugar. It is syntax sugar for what we just saw, and the new modern way to do it using async and await would look a little bit something like this. So we can just use the async keyword and then we can return typical values, and we already automatically know that this will return a promise. So let's actually try calling this function. We'll say hello world. I'll actually make a variable for now. I'll say value or C value. Why not? We'll do C value. And then let's just console log C value. So if we were to run this file, we see that it's ultimately a promise, right? So we're not actually getting the value of the promise. We're getting a promise. So this is very similar to what we saw in the last lesson. So as you guys probably already know, if you watched the last lesson, you can probably do something like, you know what, let's remove C value as a thing. We can immediately just, off of a promise, we can immediately call the then method, and this defines code that will run once the promise has resolved. So we can do something like this. This is what we saw in the previous video. However, if we're using the async keyword, it's probably best practice for us to use await. So let's actually use the async and await keywords together and see how we can cleanly write asynchronous code without having to rely on this then method that attaches a callback or whatever. So let's actually create a new function. I'll call it app, and this function will barely do much. And all this function will do is we will call hello world. Let's have this be a variable. So we'll call it value, but we're going to use the await keyword. So as you guys can see, there's an error, and the error says await expressions are only allowed in async functions. So if you guys do want to use the await keyword, you guys have to mark your functions as asynchronous. So an await keyword only works in async func. So we have to use async, and now this error disappears. And then now we can console log value is, and I'm just going to pass in the value, and voila. So now this is an example of how we can use the async and await keywords together to write asynchronous code. This app function would be the equivalent to doing something like hello world, and then like you guys have seen in the previous videos, then value console.log. So as you guys can see, the app function and this code here is doing the exact same thing, but using async and await is essentially syntax sugar for doing this, because writing code like this amongst synchronous code could look very messy, while having code that is written like this, having well-defined async functions and using the await keyword can be a lot easier to read. The reason being is because when we write code like this, let me actually just remove this ugly code so we don't even have to look at it anymore. We're done using that. When we write code like this, it allows us to write asynchronous code in JavaScript that looks synchronous. In this app function, this hello world will pause execution in this app function. We will actually wait for this value before we run the console log in line 11, which is contrary to what we've seen before. But the reason why this happens is because this is a async function. So even though we're pausing in this function until hello world resolves, this will be non-blocking to any other code that fires in our program, which is very useful. So this is essentially the basics of using async and await and how we can better use promises to write asynchronous code. The way I think of it is async and await is just a pretty way to write promises and deal with promises in JavaScript. Before I end this video, I wanted to show a real-world example and show how we may use async and await to do something that is probably more prevalent in real-world code. So I have two functions. I have get users from API, which essentially uses the fetch API to communicate with a server, a local server I have running on my local computer. And once we get the response data, we'll actually call this .json method, and this also returns a promise with any type. And that actually allows us to define our own custom type whenever we're dealing from data that we get back from a server. So we have this function, and then we have the actual function that calls it. Fetch users with await, and this function uses the await keyword, and we will use this to write asynchronous code that will read and kind of run in a synchronous manner. So let's actually call this file or run this file. And what we get in the logs, we first get the user data, and then we get the function log app function finished. So this is expected, and as you guys can see, it's not like line 23 ran before line 16 or anything like that. Because this was an async function, await actually paused execution in this function without blocking any of the other code that may run in your program. So that's essentially the basics of using async and await, and a real world example of using async and await. Like I've said previously in this video, it's just syntax sugar for using promises, because just using promises and the then callback can be kind of robust, if you ask me. I hope everybody has a great day, and I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, and I'll leave a link to the code in the description. Goodbye.